The wind swept gently across the open plains, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and fading summer grass. The sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in soft amber, and the Dempsey ranch lay, quiet except for the creak of the barn door and the mournful call of a lone hawk. John Dempsey stood on the porch, his hat low, his weathered hands gripping the railing as if it could keep him from falling apart. Just weeks ago, this land had been filled with laughter, her laughter, and now it felt like a hollow shell. Mary had been the heart of everything. Her voice used to echo through these fields, calling out to him from the stables, teasing him over supper, whispering good night when the oil lamp dimmed. But the fever had taken her quickly, too quickly for prayers or medicine to matter. The men from town had come for the funeral, hats pressed against their chests, murmuring words of comfort that didn't reach his heart. After they left, John buried himself in work, fixing fences, mending saddles, feeding horses, anything to keep from hearing the silence inside the house. But grief had a way of finding him even in the wind, in the smell of her hair that still lingered on her shawl, in the way the morning light touched her favorite window. The figure driving it was small, determined, and familiar. As it drew closer, John's heart stirred for the first time in weeks. It was Clara, Mary's younger sister. He hadn't seen her in years, not since she married and moved east. Eyes shining with both grief and compassion. "I came as soon as I heard," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You shouldn't be alone out here, John." He didn't know how to answer. Words felt heavy, unnecessary. He just nodded, taking her bags, letting her step into the house that still smelled of loss. For a long while, they said nothing. The fire crackled, and the shadows danced on the walls. That night, John sat outside, staring at the horizon, listening to the coyotes call in the distance. Inside, Clara moved about quietly, lighting a lamp, folding blankets, tidying up as if trying to bring life back into the empty rooms. He didn't understand it yet, how grief and hope could live in the same heart. But as the stars blinked above, John felt something small and fragile stirring inside him. Maybe it was healing, or maybe it was the first breath of a story that wasn't over yet. John stepped into the kitchen and found Clara already awake, wearing one of Mary's old aprons, her hair tied back in a simple braid. She turned when she heard his boots on the floorboards and gave him a faint smile, the kind that didn't erase sorrow but reminded him that kindness still existed in the world. "You look thinner than I remember." He tried to smile but couldn't quite manage it. "Work keeps me lean," he muttered. They sat across from each other in silence, the way two people do when grief binds them in unspoken understanding. Outside, the horses neighed, the wind rattled the shutters, and somewhere a memory tried to surface. Mary laughing as she spilled flour all over the floor, teasing him for his serious face. John swallowed hard and set his cup down. Days turned into a rhythm. Clara took charge of the house with quiet determination, cleaning, cooking, feeding the chickens, and bringing order back to the chaos that loss had left behind. She didn't talk much about Mary, but sometimes John would find her standing by the small wooden cross behind the garden, her lips moving in silent prayer. One evening, as the sun bled across the fields, they rode out together to round up a few strayed cattle. Clara handled the reins like she'd been born in the saddle. Her courage surprised him, the way she faced the open land without fear. When the herd was finally settled, they rested by a stream, the sound of water soft against the hum of crickets. She loved this place, Clara said quietly, gazing at the reflection of the fading light. Said it was more than a home, it was part of her soul. John nodded slowly. "I reckon it still is," he whispered. Their eyes met for a brief moment, not in romance, but in shared remembrance. Something gentle passed between them then, something human and healing. That night, John couldn't sleep. The ranch felt different now, lighter, warmer. Clara's presence had filled the empty spaces Mary left behind, not replacing her, but reminding him that life, stubborn as the prairie grass, keeps growing even after the fire. He looked at the vast land spread before him, golden and endless. Maybe, he thought, this was what Mary would have wanted, not for him to drown in sorrow, but to find his way back to living. Inside, Clara hummed softly as she began her morning chores, and for the first time in a long while, the sound of a woman's voice in that house didn't hurt. It felt like hope, Autumn crept gently across the plains. The golden grass turned copper beneath the fading sun, and the air carried the scent of wood smoke and rain. Life on the Dempsey Ranch began to find its rhythm again. The horses grew strong, the fences stood firm, and for the first time since Mary's death, laughter, faint but real, returned to the porch. Clara had a way of brightening the place without trying. She'd hum old tunes while hanging laundry. She wasn't like Mary. Mary had been bold, full of fire and mischief. Clara was gentle, steady, her strength quiet but unwavering. And somehow, that calmness began to ease the storm that had been raging in John's heart. One cool evening, after a long day mending the barn roof, John found Clara sitting on the steps, watching the sky turn violet. She handed him a tin cup of coffee, her fingers brushing his just for a second, enough to send a strange warmth through him. "You've done a lot for this place," he said softly. "More than I ever expected." Clara smiled faintly. It's what she would have wanted. She loved you, John, and she loved this ranch. Helping you feels like keeping her memory alive. He looked at her, the light from the setting sun glinting in her eyes, and for a heartbeat, he couldn't tell whether he saw Mary's reflection or Clara's truth. There was a tenderness there, something fragile but real. He looked away quickly, ashamed of the feeling that rose inside him. The days grew shorter, and with them came a kind of comfort neither of them had planned. They worked side by side, branding cattle, tending to the garden, sharing quiet suppers by the fire. Sometimes John caught himself watching her laugh, noticing the way her braids slipped over her shoulder, or how she looked up at the stars like she was listening to heaven itself. Still, he fought it. But the heart doesn't ask permission. It just remembers how to beat. One night, as the first snow began to fall, Clara brought out Mary's old quilt and wrapped it around his shoulders while he sat on the porch. "You'll catch cold," she scolded gently. John looked at her, his eyes soft. "You sound just like her." Clara smiled sadly. "Maybe that's why you let me stay." He wanted to tell her it wasn't that it was something deeper. Instead, he just nodded, holding the quilt tighter as the snow fell quietly around them. For the first time in months, the cold didn't feel so lonely. Winter came hard that year. Snow blanketed the ranch in silence, and the world seemed to pause under the weight of white. John spent his days chopping firewood, mending the barn roof, and keeping the herd safe from the cold. The two of them worked together as if they'd been doing it all their lives. On Christmas Eve, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Clara sat near the hearth, sewing a tear in one of John's coats, while he carved a small wooden horse, something to keep his hands busy, something to quiet his thoughts. After a while, he looked up. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked quietly. "Going back east?" Clara paused, her needle hovering in midair. "I did," she said, "at first, but then I realized there's nothing for me there anymore. My family's here, or what's left of it." Their eyes met, and neither looked away. The firelight flickered between them, warm and golden, and something unspoken passed through that space, something honest and unbreakable. Weeks turned into months, and when spring returned, so did the color of life. One afternoon, John found himself standing by Mary's grave, hat in hand, the breeze soft against his face. Clara stood beside him, her head bowed in quiet respect. "I'll never forget her," he said, his voice rough but steady. "But I think she'd want me to live again." Clara reached out and took his hand, not out of pity, but out of love. "She would," she whispered. "She'd want you to be happy." It was as if the earth itself exhaled, letting go of the pain that had lingered for too long. The townsfolk gathered, whispering softly about how the cowboy had found love again. This time not out of passion, but out of something deeper, understanding, healing, and shared loss. Clara looked radiant in her simple white dress, and when John took her hand, his eyes were clear and full of life again. "Thank you," he said softly as they stood before the altar, "for bringing light back into my world." She smiled through her tears. "It was always here, John. You just needed to see it again." As they walked out into the sunlight, the wind swept across the plains, carrying away the ghosts of yesterday. The Dempsey Ranch, once silent and broken, and somewhere, beyond the clouds,